Economic challenges in Japan in the 1920s, the financial crisis. This video deals with the economic challenges that Japan faced in the 1920s and the 1930s. Also, how this might have led to the rise of militarism in Japan. This is an area that some of you have difficulty understanding because the economic ideas might be a bit more complex, a bit more difficult to understand because the economic forces are invisible in nature. Even more so, if this is mixed with the impact on the Japanese people and the political events, it becomes even more confusing. So in this video, we want to focus on the economy of Japan in the 1920s and the financial crisis that it faces. We will deal with rural Japan and the impact of the Great Depression in a separate video. And we hope that these three series of videos will help you understand Japan's economic challenges in the 1920s and how this made the development of democracy in Japan difficult. The international situation of Japan in the 1920s and the 1930s. By the 1920s, things had changed. Things were looking up. Japan had become a modernized country. It was a global power. It had constitutional monarchy with a democratically elected parliament called the Diet. Japan had a modern military and had won major wars overseas, the Russo-Japanese War, the Sino-Japanese War, and World War I. Japan was an active member of the international community. It took part in the League of Nations. It ruled colonies of its own in Taiwan, in Korea, and in 1931 onwards in Manchuria. Japan also had special rights in China as well as Manchuria. Despite these successes, the Japanese economy showed signs of weakening in the 1920s. Why is this so? There were tensions in Japanese society which would explode into a wave of militarism in the 1930s. How far was this caused by the forces of economics and social change? The economic boom and expanding middle class, 1918 to the 1920s. Japan's economy had done very well between 1914 to 1919. There was a boom. There was a growing middle class. There was unprecedented social freedoms and luxury. Such social freedoms as females cutting their hair in short and bob hairstyles, wearing chic dresses and high-heeled shoes, and having modern outlooks towards life was accepted. There was also the rise of democratic parties in the 1920s. And the ordinary Japanese, especially in the cities, experienced many changes in daily life. They wore modern and Western-style clothing, fanciful hats with traditional outfits. They ate new foods like sandwiches and steaks and other kinds of Western cuisine. Trains and cars and electricity and all kinds of consumer goods were available in the Japan cities. People went to work in cars, buses, trolleys in the major cities. In 1927, Japan even built its first subway line, the first of its kind in East Asia. Japan's universal education system worked very well. There were high rates of literacy. This led to a boom in the publishing business, books, journals, and newspapers. Many countries look to Japan as a shining example. Middle-class families had money to spend at restaurants, on entertainment, and for travel. In the cities, people went to watch cinemas, they watched movies, they listened to the radio, and they had improved standards of living. Between 1918 to 1921, Japan even had its first Christian prime minister, who was a commoner, and his name was Hara Takashi. Unlike his predecessors, Hara was not a baron or count, nor did he hold any rank of nobility. He was even elected into power in 1918 with the slogan, "Militarism is dead." However, there was a kind of social tension that was building in the air. Some Japanese thought that Japan was modernizing and westernizing at a pace, at a speed, which was necessary for Japan to become part of the modern world. Others were concerned about Japanese society losing their own traditions, that it had swung too far to the west. However, there were hard times ahead, and the economy was beginning to slow down. Economic challenges and changes. 1920, post-war collapse. After World War I ended in 1918, there was less global demand for Japanese goods. Japanese products could not compete with goods produced in USA and Europe and elsewhere. The Japanese companies were large, inefficient, unproductive compared to other global companies because these factories had less capital, they had less access to raw materials, they used older and more outmoded machines, and many of the goods were considered inferior and they couldn't keep up with goods produced elsewhere. As such, many companies faced hard times. Many Japanese workers were retrenched. They lost their jobs in various industries as the factories cut operating costs. First, they cut their salaries, and then they cut the jobs of the workers. 1920 was the first crisis. The Japanese stock market index fell by nearly 55%. Japan's main export was silk and cotton. The prices of these goods also fell tremendously. The price of cotton fell 60%, silk 70%. Many businesses became bankrupt, and there was a large-scale unemployment in Japan. Inflation on the rise. The price of basic goods fluctuated wildly. In 1919, 100 yen could buy you a kilogram of rice, a set of 10 postcards, or maybe a few bottles of drinks. By the early 1920s, due to inflation or the rise in the value of basic products, you could buy a lot less. For example, the price of rice increased by more than 170%. Bank failures. In the 1920s, Japan also experienced several bank failures, which affected Japan's economy badly. For the longest time, the banks in China had not really been tightly regulated or managed by the central government. There were many small banks, as many as 2,000. This banking situation worked well as long as the economy was booming. Why so many banks, you might ask? Essentially, this is how the Japanese banks work. Say, for example, there's a famous family in a village, a town, or city, and they want to run a business. The family will set up a company to produce something, let's say silk, but it wants to keep it under its full control without raising stock in the public stock exchange or borrowing it from someone else or some other banks. So to finance its own activities, the family will set up its own bank. Since the family has a good reputation locally in its community, people from the same village, the same town, or the same city will deposit their savings in this family-run bank, believing it to be safe and reliable without knowing its real financial situation. When Japan's economy slowed down after 1918, these small banks began to face financial difficulties. Their businesses had less orders due to less demand for goods. In some cases, these companies would borrow money from other banks or other institutions, leading to a vicious cycle of bad debts, which was run up by all these small family-run banks. In April 1920, the first bank crisis occurred. The Masuda Bill Broker Bank in Osaka failed. Over the next 4 months, 21 other banks were affected, and their banking operations were suspended to prevent other banks and the whole financial situation from worsening in Japan. There was a concern that other banks might go bankrupt. So in order to resolve this issue, the Bank of Japan, the central government, provided special loans to ensure that these banks would remain in operation. The floating of these banks through special loans eased people's concerns about Japan's financial markets and the banking system. But it just created more bad debts, and the problems for the Japanese government and the economy would increase. You can't keep bankrolling or giving special loans to ease a financial situation. The Great Kanto Earthquake. The Great Kanto Earthquake happened in 1923. The Great Kanto Earthquake occurred in the Tokyo-Yokohama area and hit 7.9 on the Richter scale. In Tokyo alone, 570 houses were destroyed. There were more than 100,000 people who died. And there were almost 1.5 million homeless people. Economic losses were estimated to be 6.5 billion yen. So how are banks and businesses and people going to rebuild their homes, and how are they going to repay their loans, especially after this earthquake? They could not afford to pay off their bank loans or their debts. As a result, the government again introduced special funds to buy up these loans to ensure financial and economic stability. Several Japanese businesses put up false claims, and the cycle of bad debts and government financing these conditions again continued. The government continued to support financially unstable and weak banks and companies rather than shut them down. The 1927 banking crisis. In 1927, the banking situation worsened. A company called Suzuki Shoten, which was turning in huge profits as high as the big Zaibatsu trading companies like Mitsui and Mitsubishi, faced a bad debt problem. They had borrowed so much money that some banks finally refused to lend them more money. People expected the Japanese government to manage the problem by providing, once again, special loans and special packages. But this was not the case. The Privy Council, which was the advisors to the emperor, under strong influence from conservative politicians, rejected the Prime Minister's proposal to help out these banks. 37 banks throughout Japan went bankrupt, including Suzuki Shoten. This caused widespread panic because people rushed to the banks to withdraw their deposits as quickly as they could. You can imagine the financial hardship it caused, because the collapse of banks meant that the savings of millions of Japanese, and especially the middle class, would be wiped out. The government ordered all banks closed voluntarily for 2 days. Then they introduced a 3-week moratorium, or suspended virtually all financial obligations and transactions. These measures helped to protect the banks against big deposit withdrawals. So they allowed the people to just withdraw small amounts for their living expense. And you know what? It worked. There was some level of calm that was restored. But in 1929, the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, which took place in America, sent ripples around the world. Japan's economy would fall by almost 20% by 1929 and 1931, all caused by the Great Depression. It was disastrous for the development of democracy. Conclusion. In conclusion, you've seen how Japan's economy was weakened by World War I and its impact on Japanese society. It was a period that showed the rise of democratic political parties in Japan in the 1920s. People had the universal right to vote in 1925. There were great hopes of a democratic and peaceful Japan led by civilian politicians based on economic growth and prosperity. However, as you've seen, inflation, a slowdown of Japan's economy, several banking financial problems in 1920, then in 1927, weak banking regulations, and finally the Great Depression, which we'll see in the next video, all added up to put down people's high hopes that democracy could work out in Japan.